3 men were arrested by the KGB. Their names were removed from official records. Their families were told nothing. They were taken to Lefortovo prison in Moscow, interrogated until there was nothing left to say, and then executed, each of them with a single shot to the back of the head. They had risked everything to pass secrets to the Americans. They had trusted that the system protecting them was airtight. They had been told their identities were known only to a handful of people inside the most secure intelligence agency in the United States. One of those people was the man who had handed their names to the KGB. He drove home after work that evening. He had dinner with his family. He said grace before the meal, as he always did. And the next morning he walked through the metal detector at FBI headquarters in Washington, badged through the turnstile, sat down at his desk, and went back to work. His name was Robert Philip Hanssen. He would do this for 22 years. And he would never, not once, not for a single day across more than 2 decades, be suspected by the organization that employed him to hunt people exactly like him. This is not fiction. Every word of what follows is documented, verified, entered into court records and government reports and intelligence assessments that took years to compile. And when you reach the end of this story, the thing that will stay with you is not the magnitude of the betrayal, though the magnitude is staggering. It is the simplicity of it, the almost insulting simplicity. The FBI paid $7 million to a Russian spy to learn the name of its own traitor. $7 million. 22 years. And the answer had been sitting in the same building the entire time. Before we go back to the beginning, one thing you need to understand about the institution he destroyed from within. The FBI is not simply a law enforcement agency. It is a symbol. It is the idea that there is a line between order and chaos, and that there are people standing on the right side of that line. People who chose to dedicate their lives to protecting the country, who were screened, who were vetted, who swore an oath of loyalty. People who sleep soundly at night because they did the right thing. Robert Hanssen was one of those people, at least on the surface. He was born in Chicago on April 18, 1944. His father, Howard Hanssen, was a city police officer. Howard was a hard man, emotionally cold, the kind of father who does not praise, does not embrace, who expresses affection through silence and absence. Robert grew up quiet, introspective, with an intelligence that the people around him could never quite categorize. He was not the popular kid. He was not the athlete. He was the boy who read, who watched, who processed everything internally and said almost nothing out loud. He graduated from Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois in 1966 with a degree in chemistry. And even then there was something unusual. Alongside chemistry, he had also studied Russian. A choice that nobody around him took very seriously at the time, but that investigators would look back on decades later with a kind of retroactive unease. After graduation, Hanssen went to Northwestern University, where he started dental school, then switched to business and earned an MBA in accounting and information systems. 2 completely different paths, which already tells you something about a man who could not decide what he wanted to be, or who wanted to be everything at once, but could not figure out how any of it fit together. In between, he spent time with the Chicago Police Department, working in an internal investigations unit that his colleagues nicknamed the Super Snoops, a short-lived elite intelligence group that was quickly disbanded for lack of results. Hanssen left with no major achievements, but with one skill that nobody had documented. He knew how to think like someone who does not want to be found. In 1968, he married Bernadette Vogt, Bonnie as everyone called her, a woman from a deeply conservative Catholic family. Bonnie's family had close ties to Opus Dei, the ultra-conservative Catholic movement that some call an organization, others call a cult, and that the Vatican itself regards with a mixture of official respect and quiet discomfort. Robert had been raised Lutheran, but converted to Catholicism because of her, and it was not a superficial conversion, not the kind where you show up at Christmas Mass and call it a year. It was total, intense, almost monastic. He prayed every day. He attended Mass regularly. He carried religious texts. He believed, or at least appeared to believe with every conviction a human being can demonstrate, that God was real and that a moral life mattered. Remember that detail. It matters. In January 1976, Robert Hanssen joined the FBI. He was 32 years old. He started as a field agent in Gary, Indiana, was transferred to New York City in 1978, and later moved to headquarters in Washington. He was good at the technical work, rigorous, meticulous, efficient. But there was a problem that never went away. He was impossible to be around. Colleagues described him as arrogant, condescending, and difficult. He corrected supervisors in front of other agents. He berated co-workers when he thought they had done something wrong. He refused to perform respect for people he considered intellectually inferior, and the universe of people he considered intellectually inferior was enormous. A veteran agent who worked with him in the New York Soviet division later said, "People who are super religious, for whom only God meets their standards, usually have no time for mere mortals." He thought he was mentally superior to his peers. A supervisor once said simply that he could not stand to be in the same room with him for more than 10 minutes. Inside an institution like the FBI, where the hierarchical culture is rigid and internal loyalty is almost religious, that kind of behavior has consequences. Hanssen was passed over for promotions. He was transferred to positions that looked like reassignments but felt like punishments. He was placed on secondary projects while colleagues with less talent and better social skills moved up. He knew it, and it ate at him. But what nobody knew, what nobody could have imagined, was that in November 1979, just 3 years after joining the FBI, Robert Hanssen walked into the offices of the Amtorg Trading Corporation in New York City, a Soviet front company known in intelligence circles as a contact point for the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Agency, and offered to betray the United States, on his own initiative, without being approached, without being seduced by a foreign agent, without a story of blackmail or debt. He woke up one day and decided. He walked in and said, "I work for the FBI, I have access to information you want, and I am willing to share it. Stop for a moment and absorb that." In every spy movie, there is a moment where the protagonist gets recruited, a moment of vulnerability, a trap, a seduction carefully orchestrated by a patient enemy. That is not what happened with Hanssen. He was not recruited, he applied. And he was careful from the very beginning. He never revealed his real name to the GRU. He operated in total anonymity, using dead drops, pre-arranged hidden locations where packages of documents and cash could be exchanged without the two sides ever meeting in person. He would leave a signal, sometimes just a strip of tape on a park sign, to tell his handlers that a drop was loaded. They would come, collect the material, leave the payment, and disappear. That kind of operational discipline, unusual for someone with no formal espionage training, said everything about what was coming. What did he hand over in those first years? Among other things, he revealed to the GRU the identity of Dmitry Polyakov, a Soviet general who had spent decades passing information to the CIA, rising through the ranks of the Soviet army, all while secretly working for the Americans. Polyakov was not a low-level informant. He was a major general, a man who had given the Americans priceless intelligence on Soviet military doctrine, weapons technology, and the inner workings of the GRU itself for more than 20 years. The CIA considered him perhaps the most valuable human asset the United States had ever cultivated inside the Soviet military. A man who had risked his life, his family, and everything he had, not for money, but because he genuinely believed the Soviet system was wrong and wanted to do something about it. Hanssen burned him as a calling card, as a way of saying to the GRU, "Look what I have access to. Look what I am worth. Look what I can do for you." Polyakov was arrested in 1986. He was interrogated for nearly 2 years. He was executed in 1988. Robert Hanssen had sent one of America's most important intelligence assets to his death before collecting a single dollar, and he never mentioned it, not to his wife, not to his confessor, not to the priest at Sunday Mass, not once. At this point, you are probably asking yourself, how does someone do that? How does a person who goes to Mass, who prays, who believes in God, who raises 6 children, how does that person hand a man to his executioners with the same detachment he would use to file a year-end report? That is the question psychologists, criminologists, and intelligence experts spent decades trying to answer. And the answer, to the extent one exists, is disturbing in its simplicity. Hanssen saw no contradiction. In his mind, the two things existed in separate airtight compartments. There was the Robert, who prayed and drove his kids to school and voted conservative and attended Opus Dei meetings. And there was the Robert, who handed secrets to the Soviet Union. These two Roberts coexisted without one ever having to answer for what the other was doing. The forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Hanssen after his arrest described this mental structure as deep narcissistic dissociation, a psychological architecture in which the individual becomes the moral center of the universe, and every action gets reinterpreted in whatever way is needed to preserve the self-image. For Hanssen, betraying the FBI was not betrayal. It was rightful revenge against an institution that had underestimated him. It was him proving to himself that he was the smartest man in the room. There was also a more practical reason, one the investigators noted with a certain grim surprise: money. Hanssen had married into a family with a lifestyle that his FBI salary could not fully support. They had 6 children and a commitment to private school tuition, parish tithing, and a house in a respectable suburb. The numbers did not add up. And a man who considered himself exceptional, surrounded by constant evidence that the system saw him as mediocre, found in espionage an exit that solved 2 problems at once: the financial one and the one involving his ego. For Robert Hanssen, spying was both necessity and game. A deadly game, a game that cost lives, but a game. And he needed to win. In 1980, something happened that should have ended everything. Bonnie Hanssen found a letter in the basement of the couple's house in Scarsdale, New York. A letter from the GRU addressed to her husband. She confronted Robert immediately. He did not deny the contact, but he minimized everything. He told her he had been feeding false information to the Soviets, playing them for money, that what he had done was essentially a deception operation, that he had done nothing wrong. Bonnie did not fully believe him, but she also did not know what to believe. She insisted they go together to see their priest. The two of them drove to New Rochelle to meet with Father Robert Bucciarelli, a priest affiliated with Opus Dei who had known the family for years. Bucciarelli heard everything, and then he made a decision that, looking back, carries consequences that are almost impossible to fully measure. He told Hanssen he would not go to the authorities. He said that if Hanssen promised to stop, cut off all contact with the Soviets, and donated the dirty money to charity, he would have the church's absolution and its silence. Hanssen agreed. He donated the roughly $20,000 he had received, in installments of $1,000 at a time, to the Missionaries of Charity, Mother Teresa's organization, and Bonnie believed it was over. He had stopped, in fact, at least for the moment, and nobody went to the FBI. The priest was bound by the seal of the confessional. Bonnie chose the marriage, and Robert Hanssen understood in that moment that he had survived the only person who could have destroyed him, the woman sleeping next to him. From 1981 to 1985, Hanssen went quiet. During that period, he was transferred to Washington, worked in the budget division, and then was assigned to the FBI's Soviet Analytical Unit, a position that gave him extraordinary access to the full scope of American counterintelligence operations against the Soviet Union. He was quite literally learning the secrets he would sell next. He spent 4 years learning them, and then he came back. In 1985, Robert Hanssen came back. This time he did not go to the GRU. He went straight to the KGB, the Soviet State Security Service, more professional, better funded, with a longer institutional memory. He wrote a letter by hand to the KGB's Washington residency, handwritten so there would be no digital trail. No name, no identifying details, only the cover name he would use for the rest of his life, Ramon Garcia. The letter was direct, cold, and businesslike. He described himself as someone with access to high-level American intelligence. And this time, unlike 1979, he was explicit. He wanted $100,000 in exchange for what he had to offer. The KGB accepted. And then began the most devastating period of espionage in 20th century American history. You have to understand the context of 1985. The Cold War was at its peak of mutual paranoia. Ronald Reagan had called the Soviet Union an evil empire 2 years earlier. The Strategic Defense Initiative, the famous Star Wars program, was in development. Both sides had nuclear arsenals capable of destroying human civilization several times over, and each side knew the other knew it, and the logic of all international tension depended on both sides protecting their secrets tightly enough to prevent the other from calculating a decisive advantage. That was the paranoid balance, that knife's edge between peace and annihilation, in which Robert Hanssen was selling information. Almost immediately, he handed the KGB something devastating: the names of 3 Soviet officers who had been recruited by the CIA and the FBI and were working as double agents for the Americans. 3 men who had risked their lives to pass information to the American side, who trusted that the system was protecting them, who lived under cover identities carefully constructed by intelligence networks that had taken years to build. All 3 were arrested. All 3 were executed. Then, in 1986, Hanssen revealed to the KGB the existence of a project the American government had spent years and tens of millions of dollars building. A secret tunnel dug by the FBI beneath the site where the Soviet Union was constructing its new embassy in Washington. The tunnel had been designed to intercept communications, cables, signals, anything that could be captured from underground. It was one of the most ambitious and expensive intelligence programs the Americans had ever attempted. By the time engineers finished construction, by the time the system was activated for the first time, the Soviets already knew everything. The tunnel never captured a single usable piece of intelligence. It cost tens of millions of dollars, took years of clandestine work, involved dozens of people who risked their careers and their freedom, and it was useless before it was ever switched on. Hanssen had not stumbled across information about the tunnel. He was assigned to the right divisions, attended the right meetings, held the right clearance levels. And more than anything else, he had learned how to make himself invisible inside the system, to appear to be the dull, unthreatening bureaucrat that nobody supervises too closely, who moves through the hallways without anyone asking where he is going. During the same period, he handed over something even more catastrophic: the American continuity of government plans in the event of a nuclear attack. Think about what that means. If the Soviet Union launched a nuclear strike against the United States, there existed a set of protocols, bunkers, evacuation routes, and command systems designed to ensure that the American government survived long enough to respond. It was the steel skeleton beneath all of nuclear policy. And Hanssen gave the KGB the blueprints for how that skeleton worked. The Soviets knew where American leaders would be sheltered. They knew which facilities were hardened. They knew how the command and control system would function after a first strike. That was not a tactical advantage. That was an existential one. In 1987, Hanssen was called back to Washington for an assignment of almost surreal irony: to investigate all known and suspected penetrations of the FBI itself, including some that he was directly responsible for. He spent months investigating himself, and naturally found nothing. It was during this same period that he did something revealing a still darker dimension of his character. While searching through the FBI's internal systems during the investigation, Hanssen came across the name of a Soviet officer who was working as a source for the Americans. The name was simply there, accessible, and Hanssen passed it to the KGB. The man was executed. That point needs to be stated plainly. Hanssen did not kill out of operational necessity. He did not kill to protect his own cover, did not kill because there was no other way out. He killed because the opportunity was there, because the name was accessible and could be traded for more money and deeper trust from his handlers. That man's death was a side effect of a spy searching for traces of himself in a database. Take a moment with that. Not a soldier in a war. Not a man under pressure making an impossible choice. A federal agent sitting at a government computer in Washington, D.C., who came across a name and traded it for money with the same detachment he would use to forward an email. And then he went home for dinner. Meanwhile, Robert Hanssen's domestic life continued exactly as before. In fact, it continued admirably. He lived with Bonnie and their 6 children in a house in Vienna, Virginia, a quiet, conservative suburb a few miles from Washington. Neighbors described him as a good, present father who showed up to his children's games, who helped out when someone needed something. A serious man, firm in his convictions but respectful. At the local parish, the Hanssens were known as committed, active members of the congregation. Robert participated in religious study groups. Some people described him as a kind of moral anchor in the community, the type of man others went to when they needed counsel on a difficult decision. But there were layers the neighbors and the fellow parishioners never saw. Hanssen had a friend, a dancer named Priscilla Sue Gailey, with whom he had developed an ambiguous, protective relationship. He gave her jewelry, purchased with Soviet money she knew nothing about. He paid off her debts. He paid for English lessons. He even took her to Egypt. Whether there was anything beyond friendship was something Hanssen always denied. What is certain is that he spent a meaningful portion of his dirty money on gifts for this woman, as though some distorted logic of redemption was at work, some need to distribute what he had obtained in a way that eased something he could not name. And there was a second layer, still more disturbing, that only surfaced after his arrest. Hanssen had secretly installed a camera system in the couple's bedroom and had invited his closest friend, a retired military officer named Jack Horschauer, to watch his intimate life with Bonnie through a live television feed without her knowledge. He had sent photographs of Bonnie to Horschauer without her consent. He had posted explicit stories about the two of them online. The psychiatrist who evaluated Hanssen described this behavior as part of a severe psychological disorder. The same dissociative structure that allowed him to betray the FBI also allowed him to betray, in ways most people cannot even put a name to, the woman who had protected his secret for decades. Bonnie never knew, not until the day of his arrest. In 1990, Hanssen's brother-in-law, who also worked for the FBI, began noticing things that did not add up. Robert's lifestyle seemed too expensive for the salary he was earning. There were details that did not fit together. The brother-in-law brought his suspicions to the Bureau. The FBI investigated superficially, found nothing conclusive, closed the case. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The world that had given the Cold War its meaning simply ceased to exist. The red flag came down over the Kremlin. The KGB was formally dissolved, or at least that is what the Russians told the world. In practice, its officers, networks, files, and assets migrated into new structures with new names, but the same functions. Hanssen stopped spying again. This time for nearly 8 years, with one exception. In 1993, he attempted to reactivate contact with the GRU. The Russians did not respond. He pulled back. During that period, something curious happened in his career. Hanssen moved into positions connected to the Bureau's own internal security, helping design systems to detect vulnerabilities, consulting on counterintelligence protocols. At some point during those years, he gave a lecture to a group of agents on the behavioral indicators of a spy. What to do when a colleague lives a lifestyle inconsistent with their salary. How to identify suspicious behavior. How dissimulation works from the inside out. Nobody in that room knew they were receiving a masterclass from the most dangerous spy in the Bureau's history. In 1999, Hanssen returned to active espionage, this time for the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the direct successor to the KGB. Why did he come back after 8 years? Investigators concluded that his reasons were multiple and had changed over time. In the beginning, it had been money and ego. Now there was something closer to dependency, an inability to disconnect from the only arena in which he had ever felt genuinely superior to everyone around him. But by 1999, the FBI had changed too. There was an ongoing investigation, not about Hanssen, but about the existence of an unidentified mole. Someone was leaking. That was clear. Soviet officers recruited by the Americans kept dying, secrets kept reaching the wrong side, and there was a ghost somewhere inside the American intelligence apparatus that nobody could identify. For years, the FBI had been convinced the spy was a CIA officer named Brian Kelly. Kelly was placed under intense surveillance. His life was torn apart. He was confronted, investigated, and treated as guilty for years. And he was completely innocent. In a coincidence that sounds like fiction but is documented fact, Brian Kelly lived on the same street as Robert Hanssen in Vienna, Virginia. The FBI was looking in the wrong place because it had committed the most human of errors. It could not bring itself to imagine that the problem was inside itself. That is when one of the most extraordinary and most embarrassing operations in American intelligence history came into play. In the late 1990s, the CIA identified a former SVR officer who had access to the file of the unidentified spy. This man had in his possession physical documents that could reveal who the mole was, documents with fingerprints, with details that could be traced. The American government paid this man $7 million. $7 million plus a new identity and relocation in exchange for the file. The man delivered. Inside the file was a cassette tape, a recording of a telephone conversation from August 1986 between a KGB officer based in Washington named Alexander Fefilov and the American spy, identified only as B. There were also documents bearing fingerprints. The FBI compared the voice on the tape against the voices of suspected personnel. Brian Kelly, the innocent man, was eliminated, in part because an analyst who had worked alongside Hanssen recognized certain unusual phrases and expressions that Hanssen habitually used. The fingerprints were run against internal records. In the year 2000, the identity of the mole was confirmed: Robert Philip Hanssen, an FBI agent who had worked at different points in his career inside virtually every sector of the Bureau's counterintelligence apparatus. A man who knew the surveillance and search procedures from the inside. A man who had helped train others to detect spies. A man who had investigated himself and come up clean. The FBI had paid $7 million to a Russian operative to learn the name of its own spy. What to do with that information required extreme delicacy. Hanssen was still active, still had access. A premature arrest could destroy the evidence needed for conviction. Waiting too long could give him time to run. The solution was to place him in a position that looked like a promotion, but was in fact a gilded cage. In January 2001, Hanssen was assigned to a new senior role, an apparently prestigious position that in reality cut him off from access to critical information. The personal assistant assigned to help him was, in fact, an undercover FBI agent placed there specifically to monitor him. Hanssen sensed that something was wrong. In the final weeks before his arrest, he wrote in his last letter to the Russians that he had been placed in a do-nothing job outside of regular access to information, and that something has aroused the sleeping tiger. He reached out to a friend at a technology company, asking whether there might be a job available. He believed he could hear static on his car radio that suggested it had been bugged, and yet, even feeling the trap closing around him, he made one more drop. On February 18, 2001, a Sunday evening, Hanssen drove to Foxstone Park in Vienna, Virginia, the same neighborhood where he lived, less than a mile from his house. He walked to the footbridge he had used as a dead drop site for years and secured a plastic garbage bag filled with classified documents to the underside of the bridge. Then he turned and walked back toward his car. FBI agents stepped out of the darkness. "Freeze! FBI!" Hanssen did not resist. He stood in silence for a moment as the handcuffs went on. Then he looked at the agents surrounding him and said, "What took you so long?" It was not surprise. It was defiance. It was a man who had spent 22 years waiting for this moment, and when it finally came, he refused to let it look like a defeat. Nearby, agents recovered the bag the Russians had left for him, $50,000 in cash. Payment he would never get to spend. The legal process that followed took months. Hanssen faced 15 counts of espionage, most of them carrying the possibility of the death penalty. The Justice Department offered a deal. If he cooperated fully, disclosed everything he had done, identified every contact, explained every method, if he gave the American government a complete picture of the damage, he would escape execution. Hanssen accepted. What the interrogation sessions revealed made experienced investigators uncomfortable in a way they had not anticipated. Hanssen was articulate, precise, and visibly without remorse. He answered questions with the clinical efficiency of someone describing a technical procedure. When interrogators tried to explore the moral dimension, when they asked how he had managed to live that way, when they tried to find a thread of humanity in the wreckage, Hanssen had an answer that varied in phrasing, but was always the same in substance. He said the FBI had treated him as mediocre when he was clearly exceptional, that the system had failed to recognize what he had to offer, that the people who occupied positions above him were, in most cases, intellectually inferior, that it was natural, nearly inevitable, that a man of his intelligence would find an alternative path. He never once spontaneously mentioned the men who had been executed because of the information he handed over. In July 2001, Robert Hanssen pleaded guilty to all 15 counts. The courtroom was quiet in a particular way that people who were there described as unlike any other trial they had witnessed. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of a reckoning that had taken too long to arrive. Bonnie Hanssen was present. She sat in the gallery without expression. Her husband did not look at her when the verdict was read. In May 2002, he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. And then, later that year, he was transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado. ADX Florence is not a prison in the way that word normally conjures an image. It is a concrete box designed to make human connection impossible. Each inmate spends 23 hours a day in a cell roughly the size of a parking space. The 1 hour of daily exercise takes place alone, in a slightly larger concrete room with no view of the outside world. There is no communal dining, no group activity, no congregation of any kind. The facility houses fewer than 500 people, terrorists, cartel leaders, men who committed crimes so severe that the ordinary prison system considered them uncontainable. Hanssen was placed there because the FBI concluded that even behind bars, he knew enough to be dangerous. The man who had spent 22 years learning the architecture of American intelligence was too valuable an asset, even involuntarily, to be housed anywhere with less absolute control. He spent more than 20 years in that cell, praying, by all accounts, reading, existing in the silence he had built for himself over a lifetime of keeping secrets. It is difficult to know whether that is justice or simply a different kind of disappearance. To understand the true scope of the damage he caused, you need to look at the numbers with the cold clarity they deserve, and at the same time resist the temptation to reduce everything to numbers, because behind each number there is a story the files do not fully tell. Across 3 periods of espionage spanning 22 years, Hanssen handed over more than 6,000 pages of classified documents. He revealed the identities of at least 3 Soviet double agents who were executed, and almost certainly more, because part of the damage was never fully audited. The Justice Department's own report referred to dozens of human assets that were compromised. He exposed interception technologies that the Americans had spent decades developing. He revealed operational methods that had to be completely discarded and rebuilt from scratch. He handed over the nuclear continuity of government plans. He burned the tunnel program beneath the Soviet embassy, and he fed information about American intelligence operations systematically and methodically from inside the very agency charged with finding people like him. In financial terms, he received approximately $1.4 million in cash and diamonds, some paid directly, some deposited into a Russian bank account he never had the chance to access. To put that in perspective, across 22 years that comes to roughly $65,000 per year. $65,000 per year for what the United States Department of Justice called possibly the worst intelligence disaster in American history. Some analysts make a point of repeating that number because it says something about Hanssen that goes beyond accounting. If it had purely been about money, he would have demanded more, negotiated harder. The money was real, but it was secondary. What he wanted at the deepest level was to win, to prove, to himself and to the institution that had dismissed him, that he was the most intelligent person in the room. And here is the cruelest irony in the entire story. In a certain sense, he was right. For 22 years, Robert Hanssen was the most intelligent person in the room. For 22 years, he operated inside the FBI without being detected. For 22 years, he handed the deepest secrets of America to its greatest Cold War adversary, and then drove home, had dinner with his family, took his children to Mass, and got up the next morning to do it all again. The system did not catch him. It could not. The only reason it ever learned his name was because it paid $7 million to a Russian to buy the file. In the years following Hanssen's arrest, the FBI commissioned an independent review of how it had all been possible. The final report, completed in 2002, was brutally candid about the Bureau's failures. Hanssen had never once taken a polygraph examination during his entire career, an extraordinary oversight for someone who worked in counterintelligence divisions for decades. The Bureau had no personnel rotation system to prevent a single individual from accumulating access to multiple sensitive areas over extended periods. There was no culture of cross-checking, no habit of asking why an agent was accessing systems unrelated to his current assignment, and there was a tacit assumption, never seriously questioned, that FBI agents were inherently trustworthy because they had been vetted at the time of hiring, as though a background check performed on day one eliminated the risk forever. Hanssen had exploited every one of those vulnerabilities with surgical precision. He knew where the gaps were because he had spent his entire career living inside them. The report recommended dozens of changes to the Bureau's internal security architecture. Many were implemented, but the investigators themselves acknowledged that there was something no structural reform could fully resolve: the problem of trusting people. Any intelligence system depends, ultimately, on human beings. And human beings can be, as Hanssen proved, far more complex and far more dangerous than any protocol can anticipate. Robert Hanssen died on June 5, 2023. He was 79 years old. He died in his cell at ADX Florence, after more than 2 decades in isolation. Bonnie Hanssen had visited him during his years in prison. She stayed with him until the end. She was the same woman who had been betrayed in ways that only came fully to light years after his arrest, not only by the spy, but by the husband. She stayed anyway. What Bonnie Hanssen thought, felt, and carried inside herself through all of those years, the files do not say. She never gave long interviews. She never wrote a book. She gave a deposition to investigators and then disappeared from the public record, which is perhaps the only thing a person in her position could reasonably do. The children grew up. Some of them spoke publicly over the years, in careful and measured terms, about trying to understand the father they had. None of them managed to offer an explanation that made sense in any way that could be summarized, because there is no such explanation. What Robert Hanssen represents in the end is something that intelligence institutions prefer not to discuss too openly, because it is too uncomfortable. He represents the possibility of the perfect inside enemy. The enemy who knows the system, because he is part of the system, who knows where the cameras are because he helped install them, who knows how the monitors work because he trained the people who operate them, who knows what looks suspicious because he spent his career defining what looks suspicious. There is no complete defense against that. No protocol eliminates that possibility because the protocol has to be operated by people, and people like Hanssen exist. They are rare, but they exist. And when they exist and find the right position and the right combination of resentment, intelligence, and moral detachment, the result is exactly what happened. 22 years of damage that the FBI itself admitted was never fully assessed. The scale of the unknown is part of Hanssen's legacy. It is not only what we know he handed over, it is what we do not know. The documents that may have reached Soviet hands without any record being kept. The information that was used in ways that were never traced back to him. The decisions the Soviet Union made, the operations it ran or chose not to run, based on intelligence provided by a man who lived in a quiet Virginia suburb and took his children to Sunday Mass. That is the magnitude of what happened, and it is a magnitude that does not fit completely inside any sentence, any report, any verdict. There is one last thing that needs to be said. When Hanssen was arrested and the news reached the public, there was the expected reaction: shock, outrage, the search for explanations. Journalists and analysts spent weeks trying to construct a coherent psychological profile. What makes a man like that? What is the DNA of a traitor? And here is what that exercise so often misses. Robert Hanssen was not a monster in any useful sense. He was something more disturbing than that. He was a man who seemed normal, who functioned normally, who had a family, friends, routines, a confessor, a parish, who cared about the things ordinary people care about, who almost certainly had moments of genuine tenderness with his children, of genuine devotion in prayer, of genuine pleasure in the small things of daily life, and who, simultaneously, without any contradiction he was willing to acknowledge, sent people to their deaths for money and pride. That is harder to process than a monster, because monsters are separate categories. Monsters are other. What Hanssen represents is not other. It is a possibility that exists in varying degrees and forms within the human condition. The capacity to compartmentalize, to separate what we do from who we are, to build an identity that does not have to answer for what happens in the other rooms. Most people never push that capacity to a point that causes real harm, but the capacity is there. And Hanssen pushed it to its absolute limit, systematically, for 22 years, inside the heart of the agency whose entire purpose was to find people exactly like him. On the evening of his arrest, as agents handcuffed him in Foxstone Park and read him his rights, Hanssen asked one last question. The last question of a life he had built with such careful, deliberate patience over so many years. What took you so long? It was not defeat. It was a farewell on his own terms. It was a man saying right to the end, I knew this was coming, I know who I am, and it still took you 22 years and $7 million paid to a Russian to find me. He was right, and that is the hardest part of this story to accept. Because in the end, after everything, after the executed agents, the surrendered secrets, the useless tunnel, the revealed nuclear plans, the destroyed lives, the marriage betrayed in ways no confession could undo, the most dangerous man the FBI ever produced was not defeated by the system he had sworn to protect. He was simply found, and only after an eternity.